Are you a water lover or a lover of poetry about water? If so, I think you're going to love this.
Rain is falling in a reassuring rush, a temporary constant. I'm lying down, listening in all my cells.
Today's Meet the Poet is with Leonie Rushforth, and we're discussing her recent poetry book, Deltas, all about deltas and water and the majesty of nature. Leonie was a Costa Prize judge and a Forward Prize judge, and she is a brilliant poet, a fantastic guest to chat to. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, drop us a like or a comment, subscribe to our Facebook and YouTube channels, sign up to the Homestage Poetry mailing list to be kept notified about all things poetry related, and follow us on socials at Homestage Poetry. Now let's get started. Leonie, welcome to Meet the Poet. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you on this, Tuesday? It's Tuesday. How are you today?
Well, I'm very glad to be here and talking to you. Thanks very much for inviting me. And generally fine, although it's been quite difficult answering that question for the last 2 years.
Oh yeah, no, I completely relate to that. But I'm glad you're well today. Looking forward to the recording. I'm so pleased to have you here. I mean, Deltas, I have been poring over this and absolutely loving the book, so I can't wait to discuss it with you. But first, I mean, it'd be nice to give our audience a feel for what you've done up until now and what has been your experience of the poetry world. How did you get into poetry to begin with? Where did it all kick off for you?
I think it was around in my childhood, as it is for most of us, just in forms that stick with you then for the rest of your life, all the nursery rhyme type of poetry. And I liked writing it, even then, at primary school. It was in the primary school, the wonderful stage of primary school education, where you did sort of creative dance and wrote poetry. It was a lovely phase of things in education. And then, I wrote poetry through my adolescence and published in school magazines and things, but I didn't really seriously get started until I studied. That is, until I started reading seriously a lot of poetry at university. And then when I left there, I was lucky enough to get a job on a literary magazine that a friend of mine became editor of, Bananas, a really beautiful newsprint magazine designed by Julian Rothenstein and started up by Elaine Feinstein and Emma Tennant and J.G. Ballard. And I joined it as an assistant editor when I left university and had a few years then of, reading what was being written at the time. We had masses of submissions, and most of our time was spent reading them and arguing about them. And that was just a lovely thing to be able to do. And then there was a bit of a chaotic period of changing jobs all the time and trying to save enough money to have time off to write, and then realizing I was becoming very a high risk employee. So I trained as a teacher and then found I really loved it. So I stayed then as a teacher, earned my living as a teacher all my life, and was able to read and talk about poetry every day that way. So poetry's always been there, in different forms, different ways, but always there.
And it's sort of the dream to be able to spend all day, every day talking and discussing poetry. I mean, we've talked about this before, but how have you found the teaching experience with poetry, not everyone being completely receptive or as engaged with poetry as others? How have you found that?
Well, the great thing about talking about it with children is that they're completely straightforward about what the problems are. And so I learned a lot, really, from them about why poetry feels important even to the people who are apparently hating it and resisting it. There's a very strong attraction, as strong as the repulsion. And so it's a knotty problem, and one that they were interested in enough to stick with it, and that I found endlessly interesting. It was never the same with two people, and it was never the same from year to year. So that was a great education for me. in terms of what it is that brings people to a poem, and then what makes it so hard for them to stay with it. And of course, it's the challenges that poems very consciously pose in terms of understanding. People are not used to not being able to understand things, and not used to having to read things often, and to revise what they're thinking, and to live with being baffled as well, to enjoy not understanding.
I really like that, the idea of living with being baffled. It's an uncomfortable feeling, and not everyone likes it. As you say, that's why sometimes poetry deters people. But
Mm,
it's a fascinating state to be in, and you can actually learn a lot, I think, in that state of bafflement.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
And not just about reading poetry, but a
yeah,
certain sort of patience with regards to meaning generally.
yeah. You've also done some other really cool things. I mean, you've been a judge for the Costa Poetry Prize and for the Forward Prize. What was that like? Was it quite intense? I'm assuming it was rewarding.
Yes, it was.
Mm.
The discussions that one's part of during those quite protracted processes um, are marvelous, and bracing, and you have to think extremely hard about why it is you're holding out for a particular collection at any given time. It was just I was very lucky. It came to me through the teaching that those invitations, and it was at times overwhelming, especially initially. You know, when van loads of boxes arrive, and you just realise how many books you're actually going to be looking at and dealing with. And it is a total immersion in what's being written or what has been written in the preceding year. So you get a very strong feeling for the preoccupations, the sort of patterns in people's approaches to form. There are very strong trends you can see, and actually, often the collections that stand out are those that are somehow, um, obviously, amongst those things, but arriving independently somewhere else.
That's really interesting to be able to see sort of what the collective attitudes are, being able to work through such a large amount of poetry and notice those trends.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, down to particular words that keep recurring across collections.
Do you remember any particular words off the top of your head?
Um, yes, there was one year, I can't remember which, where the word contrail kept coming in.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Interesting. I wonder why that is. But yeah, sometimes those things do
And
happen.
backlit was another I remember now. So
Mm.
yeah, there's sort of, but actually mainly I'm talking about other sorts of broader preoccupations in terms of subject matter. Um,
Yeah.
the people, the voices, the poets who stood out were those who were um, clearly pursuing something of their own very tenaciously. Um, I don't mean sort of showily uh, other and different, but somehow quite clearly not caught up in these great waves
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
same way.
Well, I mean, it'd be nice to start delving into some of your own poetry. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about deltas, just to sort of set the scene before we hear your
Mm,
poems.
yeah. Um, well, as the title makes clear, it's a collection with a lot of water in it. Um, Delta is a poem in the collection. And when I was looking for a title and started to think about Delta as a possible title, I thought a lot more about those landscapes which are so compellingly changeable. They adapt and rearrange themselves all the time around these massive forces, these great water channels that are just going to make their way to the sea by one means or another. Um, and they're also terrains, landscapes in which are form around a division. I was very interested also in the idea of separation in this collection. and that comes through in different ways in different poems. So it became plural, actually, the title, because I chose it just at the point where the COVID variants were redesignated as letters of the Greek alphabet, and suddenly my title had become a virus. So I decided to make it plural so as not to exclude COVID, but also it made more sense. There were different landscapes in this collection.
Okay, well, let's hear. I think the first poem that we have planned to hear is In Praise of Salt Water.
Yeah. In Praise of Salt Water. It's a torment to be close to water, to sweat on a path above, unable to reach it. Everything hurts, especially eyes narrowed against this skewering light, rejected by so many surfaces. Talk dries up, and the island's sounds depend at first on the scuff of feet, and then the distant knock of water on rock. No trees, no birds, undemanding plants inserted into gaps. You'd think there might be a lizard or something akin, but there's little life here, really. The white stones too good at sloughing off water and refusing to become earth. The only thing is to keep walking, keep looking for a way down until one appears, and then descend, gingerly, slipping on loose stones, following or perhaps conjuring a path. There's nowhere to change or hide. It's a paradise. Is it? It's an inferno? Who cares? Let's take our clothes off. Slip in by this helpful basin offering a weedy lip, and let the water lift. We are not all parched, but some who are can almost feel their thirst is slaked by salt water, are comforted by the buoyancy and not having to stand up anymore. Sensus flickering to a different definition, locating limbs in 4 dimensions, swimming out.
Thank you. A gorgeous poem, I think, to start on. And I mean, it speaks to the absolute joys of, I think, of swimming, freshwater swimming. Are you a freshwater swimmer? I think you said that you are.
Yes, I'm a swimmer anywhere, actually.
Yeah. Are you quite hardy? Do you feel the cold at all, or do you just push through?
I prefer a little bit of warmth. I swim mostly in an open air Lido, which is gently heated, so the worst of the chill's taken off.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
the cold sea is good as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think why this is such a good poem to start on is that it really clearly introduces, I mean, you as the writer, your love of water, but also the need to be in it. I think that's a very key thing. And we've sort of talked before about this need for water, but why do you think that you have this need for water?
Well, I think it's a personal history of swimming that just builds on itself and becomes a need in that way. But I think it's something all people share in some way, even if they've lost touch with it. This need to be immersed in some way or at some times, because we are watery beings initially. That is, we are all in the womb in water. And I think that amniotic sort of sense of comfort and safety is very strong and deep. And even, it may be that people find that consolation in hot baths. It doesn't have to be in moving water outside. But I think it's very strong.
I love this image, this idea. I've said this to you before, but the idea of that being our first experience of water, being in the womb, and that being a home, it makes sense of that feeling of belonging that continues for the rest of your life in water. And even as you say, in a hot bath, it doesn't have to be, out in the scary ferocious, freezing cold depths of the sea, it can be something comforting like a hot bath, which is lovely. And I think, I mean, some of my favourite lines in this poem are, we are not all parched, but some who are can almost feel their thirst is slaked by salt water. And it's, you know, some people I think are more, they have that real connection of needing to be in water, but just those are beautiful words, the idea of thirst being slaked by salt water. I relate to that so much. I think, I don't know if it's having grown up by the sea or something, but yeah, I really relate to that.
Yeah. It's there are different sorts of thirst, aren't there?
Definitely. And then also another part that I really wanted to pick up on was where you say there's nowhere to change or hide. It's a paradise, is it? It's an inferno. Who cares? And I think it's this wonderful recklessness and freedom and sort of wildness of swimming outdoors. And actually, I mean, I mentioned this in the podcast that I run, the Poetry Untangled podcast, how I love that when people go swimming at the beach or wherever, they just happily get changed right there on the beach and they don't care. Like, completely different to how they would be in normal day to day. It's just a complete state of freedom.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
Yeah. I think there's something running through this poem that gets stronger towards the end, and this is perhaps where it starts to become stronger, is the feeling that this is a sort of, what do the French call these landscapes that are infused with something else, paysage moralisé. And I think that this idea of nowhere to change, it's not just changing one's clothes, it's can one become another person in some way by taking clothes off or by going into water, and the hiding as well. You know, you might want to conceal yourself in order to take your clothes off, but also there's the sense of exposure in other ways.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Okay, I think so. We've touched base with this. I think maybe let's head over to your next poem, which slightly diverts from this particular theme. But yes, I think the next one is Shrew.
Okay, Shrew. Echolocator, implacable foe of white inertia, following his nose and fierce devotion to the dark, he guards the golden grain and curses all that moves too slow, cannot see what lies ahead, but knows it cannot wait or come too soon, along the tunnels of his inspiration, as he burns his subnivean way to spring alone. Each yawning second swallows 20 heartbeats. How he shrieks his fears, how vulnerable to thunder he might die of fright. Through headlong hours he flees the gape of day's cathedral.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect example of you tunneling into these minuscule elements of the natural world. Like this shrew, where did this shrew come to you?
I was trying to remember this when you asked if I might read it. And I think it came through a friend who was talking about a tree in Richmond Park. I think it is called the Shrew Tree. And it's a tree full of all kinds of superstitious ritual and history. Anyway, it got me thinking about shrews, and I just started reading about them. And the more I read, the more I liked the idea of them. And there was something in this panic-stricken sort of solitary life that spoke to quite a lot of experience, you know, just existing in time and being terrified by time.
I like that idea of both existing in time but being terrified by it, like how you can't control that. But also, I mean, the ending, through headlong hours he flees the gape of day's cathedral. I mean, can you tell me anything more about this image? Like, where does this come from? Because that's a fantastic ending to the poem. The idea of the gape of day's cathedral.
Well, I think it begins with time rushing in two directions. There are headlong hours rushing at you. There is also the flight from them or into them. I don't know which direction that goes in, but there's, I think, also the feeling that this fleeing is going on in a massive space. I mean, that is, there can also be the feeling of being inside time in such a way as it just is beyond what the scope of one's imagination. So here's this minuscule creature. I just wanted something huge, really.
Okay, well, I think this seems quite swift, but I would like to hear your next poem, just because there are some things that I would like to say about the two, how I see the two fitting together. So the next poem of yours that we have planned to hear is The Weight.
The Weight. For weeks now I've been obedient, circling the wood's dark matter, gleaning from the wreckage of the great field the peas that grow harder by the day inside their pods. I've kept out, peering in from my short midday shadow through gaps in the guardian hawthorn, attentive to the presence of absence. This evening the sweet weight of the hay reels has been spirited away. The long meadow at the foot of the wood is as ready as a stage, and I'm loitering, for the owl, I'm told, will sometimes drift along the edge as the last light drains into the poplar leaves. Whatever happens now, but nothing happens. Or rather, between blinks, distances have been rearranged, and everything has already taken place, dark, fallen. The wood has stepped across the short grass. The wild service offers its astringent fruit.
Really beautifully read. Okay, so the reason why I thought it would be really interesting to follow the Shrew with this poem is, I mean, there are so many things in this poem actually that I'd love to pick apart. But firstly, I just think there's this curiosity, this shared curiosity almost between the Shrew and then the speaker here, watching the great field and the peas that grow harder by the day. I mean, I don't know if what you will say about this, but do you see this as this is you, and do you relate you to the Shrew at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, definitely the Shrew is me in various stages of panic. The weight is different. I mean, it's equally preoccupied with time, but this is not rushing in order to deal with time. This is waiting in order to deal with time. So I think the poem is trying to look at that expectation that we have always, I think, that something is going to happen. It's as if, there's this very strong need in us for there to be something that's going to arrive and be meaningful, so that the field is like a stage ready for something to happen. But that's not the way it is.
And I mean, then you come in the ending to this sort of like time warp. I don't know how to describe it, but it fits in with that really interestingly, where you talk about between blinks, distances have been rearranged and everything has already taken place, dark fallen. This idea that just the whole concept of time and how that will pass and what you've been waiting for, how it's just happened like that. It's it fits in really nicely to what you were saying, I think.
Yes, and it doesn't take the form you were hoping for, or sort of conjuring out of nowhere. No owls.
Yeah. And then something interesting that you mentioned there, which I wanted to pick up on, was this idea of the stage. And I love this idea that it could all be a performance, the long meadow at the foot of the wood is as ready as a stage. And it sort of speaks to this idea of obedience that we kind of have to the earth's patterns. When you say at the beginning, for weeks now I've been obedient, and it's placing yourself as an onlooker, a spectator, an audience member, rather than necessarily being involved in that process of time and nature. If I'm right in saying.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's part of that sense that something will be delivered if you wait hard enough. And then it comes, well, it is delivered, but it's not quite what one was expecting. I think that, the astringency at the end is a corrective to that.
One more thing that I did want to pick up on before we head over to your next poem is something quite small, but in between these two poems, there's a slight darkness that recurs. I mean, in Shrew, you mentioned that devotion to the dark, and then in this poem, there's the wood's dark matter. What is this darkness to you, and where does it come from? If there is a connection to be made, if I'm reading far too much into it, then
no, I think there probably is, and in other poems as well. It might not take the form of that word, but it would be there in some form. It might be just a shorthand for bringing into or acknowledging this absence that the poem also talks about. That is something sensed but not fully understood, and perhaps determining, actually, ways of being in, for example, here in the wait. I think it's connected to absence, probably.
Okay, I think let's hear your next poem then, The Way Things Move.
The Way Things Move. 1. The boats lurching between ill-matched oars. 2. The gnats and their sudden vertical leaps inside the stationary swarm. 3. The minnows and the synchronized delivery of their silver punctuation kit in the gold transparency of the river. 4. The muscular flick of their disappearance. 5. The weeds tugging like flags, the current made visible. 6. The high cloud's attenuation, or 7. The tremble between alternatives. 8. The vapor trail's failure to cohere. 9. The stillness above the weir. 10. The heron's decision.
Thank you. So this is we're coming back to fluidity, I think, here, that inherent movement that comes with water a bit more, and it's sort of, this is where I feel like we're beginning to feed back into the idea of the deltas, where there's this movement and no stagnance or anything like that. Am I right in saying that this sort of
Yes, I think so. I think in deltas there's a point where there are lots of things teeming and flickering, and I think that the minnows here are part of that. Things that are there, very powerfully present for a split second, and then they're gone.
Yeah, it's really. I love the idea of the synchronized delivery, and all these things are sort of one a school of fish, but like these things that move all in sync together is wonderful. And God, I love the imagery of the silver punctuation kit in the gold transparency of the river. It's sort of the majesty of nature. That's fantastic. I love it.
Yes, they're very beautiful. This is a tiny little river, actually, not far from its source, but perfect for just floating about on in a small boat.
Yeah. And I mean, this is just a question on the format, but what made you decide to lay it out this way, this sort of listed, this numbered list?
I can't remember actually why I did that. I do like lists though, and I think there are other poems in the collection that verge on being listy. There's one that is about finding a grave, and the directions take the form of a kind of list, although it's not numbered. I think perhaps the numbering here just sort of gives each thing its own place. It separates and creates pauses usefully. I mean, a gnat doesn't occupy much space if it's just in a sentence with other bigger things.
That's very true. I think that's really interesting how the form, you can use that to sort of dissect and divide all of these elements of the natural world and give them their own deserved space. And I think it works really, really well. So we have just a couple more poems to hear from you. I think let's head over to Leave Taking.
Leave Taking. Rain is falling in a reassuring rush, a temporary constant. I'm lying down, listening in all my cells. Soothing as water always is, the reassurance of this rain lies in the distance between here and there, me and it, not far, but far enough. It baffles the tireless human sonar. In it there's no emergent shape, no object. Presence is diffused through innumerable raindrops, raindrops without number. There has been a run of suffocating days. Last night I woke to see the curtain billowing up, lifted by the advent of cooler air. This is not a sign, I thought. The world has been wiped down for prints. The rain was on its way, is all. I'm about to take my leave. Like the rain, you're not far off.
Thank you. I'm stuck at the beginning of the poem on the words, I'm lying down listening in all my cells. I think that's wonderful.
I think that takes us back to the watery makeup of human beings. I think that apart from having this beginning in water, literally, we're composed so much of it that there must be some sort of electrical response to the sounds and movements of water.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, definitely. And the rain, I mean, it's still with this this watery idea, but I mean, you say here it's not as, it's soothing as water always is, but the reassurance of this rain lies in the distance. There's something unnerving almost going on here, and I mean, later on, the mysteriousness of the world has been wiped down for prints. What was going through your head when you were writing about this rain?
Well, you're right that distance is important in the poem. And I think, I mean, just literally there is the rather wonderful feeling of being inside, listening to rain outside. So there's something luxurious in not having to be out there getting soaked. But obviously it's working in other ways as well. And I suppose the poem is thinking about ways in which we project meaning onto things, the world generally, things, events, so that you can see a curtain billowing up and feel it is meaningful in some way, that it's suggesting arrival or presence, but actually it's just cooler air coming because rain is on the way. So it's a kind of corrective to that strong desire to impose one's need for meaning on things that you're close to or looking at or surrounded by.
I mean, that's really interesting to do in a poem as well. That's something that poets are infamous for, that sort of looking into things, perhaps more than you need to, but that's really refreshing, I think.
Yeah, so it's a sort of the world can just be the world, but it's also obviously a poem that's interested in interactions, because there's this other presence in the poem at the end of it. Yeah.
Yes, and that comes in. It's because it comes in right at the end of the poem. You're sort of left quite. I was left quite surprised. I was surprised. I was thinking, and yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, so we've got one more poem to hear from you, but I just have to say before we hear that, thank you so much for sharing your work and for being so open to discussing it with me. It's been really interesting hearing your thought processes behind it all. For everyone who's watching at home, Deltas is out with Prototype. I really encourage anyone watching to go and give it a read, because we've just sort of scratched the surface. There are so many gorgeous poems in there. So would very much recommend. And to anyone watching, if you did enjoy this, do drop Leonie a comment with any questions or thoughts you have on her work. Drop us a like, subscribe to our Facebook and YouTube channels, and follow us on socials at homestagepoetry. But once again, Leonie, just thank you so much for being here with me.
Well, thank you for reading the poems and inviting me and helping me think my way back through them. It's been lovely to do that with you. Thanks very much.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
So we're ending with the poem called Delta. Where before the sea a great river splits, between this arm and that arm, between the separating, slowing courses, letting fall their rich alluvial silt, a delta forms. Brackish channels of less consequence than the great crevasses the rivers carve, loop through grasses tall enough to hide a horse. Among little hummocks of wind-blown sand, juniper thickets seem to survive their while on silvery light alone. Nothing retains its place for long. Organisms teem, flicker, and are gone, our radical contingency made plain. The vision of a citadel trembles in and out of focus in the smoky distance, where the refinery's fat cylinders glint, and its chimneys serve as sundials. Minuscule ships making for port file orderly along the horizon's tightrope. Inland, farmhouses flattened by the sky keep their counsel and their shutters closed. You'd think the small black cattle scattered round about like peppercorns raise themselves. In geomorphological time, fragments of stranded river become lagoons, where industrious flamingo flocks shovel and sieve. White-rimmed salt pans supply the tables of satellite cities, simmering into ever deeper shades of pink, as they very slowly flower quartzy petals. We're standing where the sea once was, and will be relatively soon, despite the locks, canals, and sluices pretending to regulate willful water. There is everywhere the evidence of human ingenuity, but one man only to be seen, far off, achieving something at snail's pace on a tractor.
And how they sing the same song when they're walking to school, just the two of them. And I love the way they understand when you explain that they can't have everything, but there will be treats, sometimes, I promise. Some people don't believe in food banks, which is nice for them, I suppose.